In polite society, love is rarely spoken of. Here, it is remembered. There are marriages built on love, and marriages built on duty. This was neither, and perhaps that is why it hurt so profoundly. He spoke the words with remarkable calm. I will marry you, but I cannot give you an heir. The drawing room held its breath. Afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across Persian rugs that had witnessed generations of negotiations far less peculiar than this. Miss Evelyn Hartwell sat with her hands folded in her lap, her posture perfect despite the tremor she refused to let reach her fingers. I understand, she said. She did not. The Earl of Ashford, James Colborne to those who had known him before grief reshaped him into something quieter, watched her with eyes that had learned to observe rather than reveal. He was 37, which society considered late but not unreasonable for marriage. She was 24, which society considered dangerously close to unfortunate. You should take time to consider, he offered, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. There is nothing to consider, my lord. My circumstances are clear. They were a father's debts, recently discovered, a younger sister who deserved better than the stain of scandal, a family name that required the dignity of distance from town and its merciless gossip. What the Earl offered was salvation, a respectable marriage, a country estate far from wagging tongues, and the Colborne name to shield her family from ruin. What he asked in return seemed, at the time, a small price. She had been raised to understand that marriage was rarely about affection, that compatibility of circumstance mattered more than compatibility of temperament, that a woman's duty was to provide heirs, manage a household, and maintain appearances. If he could not give her children, she reasoned with the practicality of someone who had never been allowed the luxury of romantic dreams, then at least she would be spared the dangers of childbirth that had claimed her own mother. Then we are agreed, Lord Ashford said, rising from his chair with the controlled grace of a man who had learned to hold himself at a careful distance from everything. We are agreed, she echoed. He did not smile. Neither did she. There seemed nothing to smile about, though nothing to mourn either. It was simply an arrangement, tidy, reasonable, and profoundly civilized. They would marry within the month. She would become the Countess of Ashford. She would have security, respectability, and a husband who was, by all accounts, kind. What she did not know, what she could not possibly know as she sat in that sun-drenched drawing-room accepting her fate with the composure expected of a gentlewoman, was that his inability was not an affliction of the body. It was a vow. Made in darkness, to a ghost, in a moment of grief so consuming it had rewritten the shape of his future and, unknowingly, the shape of hers. She believed him incapable. She did not yet know he was resolute. And that difference, that single, terrible difference, would be the space where longing grew, where questions festered, where marriage that should have been merely empty became something far more devastating. A marriage where love tried to bloom in soil that had been deliberately salted. The Ton would later speak of the Ashford marriage as respectable, if peculiar. They noticed the Earl's devotion to his wife, and her quiet dignity in a house that never rang with children's laughter. Some pitied her. Some envied her freedom from maternal duties. None understood the true architecture of their restraint. But this observer did. And perhaps that is why this story must be told, not as scandal, but as the careful record of what happens when protection becomes prison, and silence becomes cruelty, and two people discover too late that some cages are built from kindness. The wedding was accomplished with efficiency rather than joy. Ashford Manor received its new mistress on a grey afternoon in early autumn, when the countryside had begun its slow surrender to winter. Evelyn stepped from the carriage and looked upon the house that would be her home, stone and history and windows that watched like careful eyes. The gardens were immaculate, hedges trimmed with mathematical precision, gravel paths raked smooth as still water. Everything spoke of order maintained, control preserved. Nothing wild had been permitted to take root here. The housekeeper, Mrs. Daintree, greeted her with warmth that felt rehearsed rather than genuine, as though she had been instructed in the precise degree of welcome appropriate for a countess who had arrived under circumstances the servants did not quite understand. The staff assembled in the entrance hall performed their curtsies and bows with flawless synchronization, their faces carefully blank. Evelyn recognized that blankness. It was the same expression she had perfected in London drawing-rooms when her father's creditors began appearing at inconvenient hours. Lord Ashford gave her a tour of the principal rooms himself, which surprised her. She had expected him to delegate such tasks. Instead, he walked beside her through chambers filled with ancestral portraits and furniture that gleamed with the devotion of servants who understood that idleness invited scrutiny. He spoke of the house's history with the careful neutrality of a museum guide, never once saying our home, always the manor, the library, the morning room. Her apartments adjoined his, connected by a door that stood closed. He showed her this arrangement without apology or explanation, simply stating that the chambers had been prepared to her comfort and that she should inform Mrs. Daintree of any requirements. The rooms were lovely, papered in soft green silk, furnished with pieces that suggested feminine taste though no woman had occupied them in years. Someone had filled the vases with late-season roses. Their fragrance was heavy, almost cloying, as though trying too hard to suggest welcome. That first evening, they dined in a room designed for 20 but set for 2. Candlelight created islands of warmth that failed to reach the corners. The Earl inquired about her comfort, her impressions of the estate, whether the journey had fatigued her. She answered with equal politeness. The conversation had the quality of a contract being fulfilled, each party performing their designated role with competence but no enthusiasm. He did not touch her. Not when he handed her down from the carriage, not when he showed her through doorways, not even the brief press of fingers that courtesy might excuse. He maintained a space around himself, a measured distance that felt deliberate rather than accidental. She found herself wondering if this was consideration or aversion, and hated that she could not tell the difference. The servants moved through their duties with unusual quietness, as though noise itself might disturb some fragile equilibrium. She caught the ladies' maid exchanging glances with a footman when they thought her attention elsewhere. Later, when Mrs. Daintree helped her prepare for bed, for the Earl kept no lady's maid, having had no lady to attend, the housekeeper's hands were gentle but her eyes held something like pity. Evelyn lay alone in her beautiful green chamber and listened to the silence of a house where nothing seemed to happen by accident and everything occurred according to invisible rules she had not yet learned. Through the closed door that connected her rooms to his, she heard nothing. No movement, no sound, no evidence of another living soul. She had married for protection. She had gained safety, security, and a title that would restore her family's standing. What she had not anticipated was how thoroughly safety could feel like isolation, or how a house full of servants could contain such profound loneliness. The questions began 6 months after the wedding, arriving with the subtlety of frost, gradual, inevitable, impossible to ignore once noticed. Lady Ashford's sister wrote first, her letters full of cheerful inquiries about country life and whether Evelyn found the manor sufficiently warm, sufficiently comfortable, sufficiently conducive. The emphasis on that final word felt deliberate, though Evelyn could not determine whether it was genuine concern or veiled curiosity. Lord Ashford's aunt arrived for a fortnight's visit in spring, bringing with her the kind of scrutiny that required no words. She observed the separate breakfast times. He rose early, she preferred later, and the way they occupied different corners of the drawing-room in the evenings, he with his correspondence, she with her needlework. At dinner, the aunt spoke at length about the Colborne lineage, about duty, about the particular responsibility that came with ancient names. She mentioned, as though in passing, that the family chapel held monuments to 7 generations of Ashford heirs, each one adding to the legacy that must not be permitted to end. Evelyn smiled and nodded and felt the weight of those 7 generations settle across her shoulders like a shawl made of stone. In London, when they ventured there for the season, the pity arrived wearing the mask of kindness. Lady Pemberton, whom Evelyn had known since girlhood, took her aside at a musicale to recommend a physician renowned for helping women with difficulties. She spoke in whispers, pressing Evelyn's hand with sympathy that felt more like accusation. Other women offered prayers, herbal remedies, advice about diet and rest and the alignment of celestial bodies. One particularly bold matron suggested that perhaps if Evelyn were less reserved, more welcoming, nature might take its proper course. She accepted their concern with grace she did not feel. Each offered remedy became another confirmation of her supposed inadequacy. Each prayer another reminder that she was failing at the single duty society considered essential to her existence. The Earl never participated in these conversations. When his aunt pressed the matter over breakfast, he changed the subject with such finality that even she fell silent. When gentlemen at his club made jokes about marital obligations, he responded with a coldness that ended both the humor and the topic. He protected her from direct inquiry with the same controlled determination he applied to everything, but his protection only deepened her shame. Because if he defended her so thoroughly, it could only mean he believed her blameless. Which meant the fault must be entirely hers. She began to inventory her failures in the dark. Too thin, perhaps. Too anxious. Too formal in manner. Too careful in speech. She recalled her mother's death in childbed and wondered if her body had inherited some fatal flaw, some invisible deficiency that made her unfit for the purpose women were made to serve. The thought arrived at night when sleep refused to come, when she lay in her green silk chamber and listened to the silence from his room and tried to understand what she had done wrong. She prayed. Not for a child, that felt too presumptuous, but for worthiness. For whatever quality she lacked that might make her sufficient. For the knowledge of how to be less of whatever she was and more of whatever he needed. The Earl remained kind, distant, unfailingly courteous. He never reproached her. Never showed disappointment. Never gave any indication that he considered her lacking in any way. His perfect composure was the cruelest thing of all. Because it meant he had accepted her failure so completely he no longer even thought to mention it. The affection came in fragments, small enough that she almost convinced herself she imagined them. A hand steadying her elbow when the garden path proved uneven after rain. The way he ensured her preferred tea appeared at breakfast without her needing to request it. How he inquired, each morning, whether she had slept well, and waited for her answer with an attention that suggested he actually cared to know. They fell into patterns that felt almost like intimacy. He read in the library most evenings, and she began bringing her correspondence there rather than sitting alone in the drawing room. Neither acknowledged the shift. She simply appeared one night with her writing desk, and he glanced up, nodded once, and returned to his book. After that, it became their routine. The silence between them grew comfortable, broken only by the scratch of her pen and the whisper of his turning pages. Sometimes she watched him when she thought he wouldn't notice. The way lamplight caught the silver threading through his dark hair. How his mouth softened slightly when he read something that pleased him. The careful deliberation with which he marked passages in his books, as though even his private thoughts required discipline. He was handsome in the way of men who had forgotten to think about such things, his attractiveness emerging from composure rather than vanity. Once, she looked up to find him watching her in return. Their eyes met across the library's firelit quiet, and for a breath neither looked away. She saw something in his expression she could not name, something that looked almost like longing, or perhaps regret. Then he blinked, the moment fractured, and he asked if she required more candles for her writing. They walked the gardens most afternoons when weather permitted. He knew the names of every plant, every tree, spoke of them with a fondness he showed nothing else. He told her the estate's history in pieces, which section his mother had redesigned, where his father had planted an orchard that never properly thrived, how the maze had been his childhood sanctuary. These small revelations felt like gifts, though she could not determine what she had done to earn them. One morning she discovered him in the conservatory, tending to a rosebush that had begun to wilt. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, his hands in the soil, his usual formality abandoned in favor of something that looked remarkably like tenderness. He startled when he noticed her, straightened quickly, but she had already seen the care with which he handled the damaged plant, the gentleness in his touch. "They require attention," he said, almost apologetic. "Neglect is what kills them, usually. Not disease or weather, but simple inattention." She wondered if he was still speaking about roses. The almost questions accumulated like debts she could not pay. She wanted to ask why he maintained such careful distance. Whether he found her company burdensome. If there was something she might do differently that would make him look at her the way he looked at his books, his gardens, his roses, with that quiet, devoted attention that suggested something mattered. But the words never came. because to ask would be to acknowledge what she increasingly suspected, that beneath his courtesy existed something warmer, something deliberately restrained. And if she was wrong, if his kindness was merely duty performed with excellence, then speaking would shatter the fragile peace they had constructed. So she remained silent. And he remained distant. And between them grew something that felt dangerously close to affection, thriving in the space where honesty should have lived. The portrait hung in the east corridor, a passage Evelyn rarely used. She discovered it by accident one afternoon when rain forced her walk indoors and she chose an unfamiliar route back to her chambers. The young woman in the painting could not have been more than 20, dark-haired and laughing, captured in a moment of such unguarded joy that it felt intrusive to look at her. No nameplate identified the subject, but the style dated it to perhaps 15 years prior, and something in the woman's eyes, their particular shade of grey, suggested Colborne blood. Mrs. Daintree found her standing there, studying the portrait with an attention that must have revealed too much. "That was Miss Catherine Ashford, my lady," the housekeeper said quietly. "His lordship's cousin. They were betrothed before she passed." The words landed with the weight of stones in still water. Evelyn turned, carefully arranging her expression into polite curiosity rather than the sharp, surprising hurt that had suddenly taken residence beneath her ribs. "I did not know he had been engaged before. A long time ago now." Mrs. Daintree's voice carried the particular gentleness reserved for old tragedies. "She was visiting the estate when the fever came. Summer, it was. Hot enough to make you think death had taken holiday, but it found her anyway. Found the babe she carried, too." The corridor tilted slightly. Evelyn steadied herself against the wall, her hand finding the cool plaster. There was a child. Early still, but yes. They'd only just told the family. The housekeeper's eyes held something knowing, something sad. His lordship took it very hard. Blamed himself, though no one could say why. He was devoted to her, Miss Catherine. After she died, he closed up half the house and would speak to no one for months. We thought he might not recover from it. But he had recovered. Into this. Into careful distance and deliberate restraint and roses he tended with a gentleness he never permitted himself to show people. Evelyn saw it now, the architecture of his control. Every measured step, every maintained boundary, every moment he pulled back just as warmth might have taken root, all of it built on the foundation of a loss so profound it had rewritten what he believed himself permitted to want. She began noticing other evidence, small relics of grief she had previously overlooked. A locked room near his chambers that the maids cleaned only when he was away from the estate. The way he avoided the family chapel, sending excuses whenever the vicar suggested prayers there. How he never touched her stomach, even accidentally, though he would steady her elbow, guide her arm, rest his hand briefly on her shoulder. At dinner one evening, his aunt mentioned Catherine in passing, some anecdote about a summer long ago, and Evelyn watched his face shudder so completely it was as though someone had drawn curtains across windows. He changed the subject with surgical precision, and his aunt, perhaps remembering too late whom she had mentioned, fell into guilty silence. That night, Evelyn stood at the door connecting their chambers. She could hear him moving beyond it, the soft sounds of a man preparing for bed alone. Her hand rose to knock, hovered, fell back. What would she say? That she had discovered his past? That she understood now why he held himself so carefully apart? That she was sorry for losses she had no right to mourn? The questions that had been forming for months took new shape. He had not said he could not give her an heir. He had said he would not. And now she understood the difference was everything. He had loved once. Loved enough that its ending had carved something essential out of him. And rather than risk such pain again, he had chosen this, a marriage of safety, distance, careful affection that never deepened into anything dangerous. She had thought herself the inadequate one. The failure. The woman whose body would not cooperate with duty. But perhaps the failure was not in her body at all. Perhaps it lived in the space between them, in the vow he had made to a ghost, in his belief that protection required the sacrifice of possibility. The realization brought no comfort. Only the cold understanding that she had been offered everything except the one thing she had begun, against all wisdom, to want. His heart was already occupied, its rooms closed to new tenants, its doors locked against further loss. She had married for safety and found loneliness. Now she realized she had fallen into something far more complicated, far more painful. She had begun to love a man who had decided, long before meeting her, that love was a luxury he could no longer afford. The physician arrived in late autumn, summoned to treat a fever among the staff. Dr. Harwick had attended the Ashford family for decades, his familiarity with the estate evident in how he navigated its corridors without direction. Evelyn encountered him in the hall outside Lord Ashford's study, the Earl having just concluded some consultation about the household's health. "Lady Ashford," Dr. Harwick greeted her warmly. "You're looking well. The country air clearly agrees with you." "Thank you, Doctor." She hesitated, then asked the question that had been building for months. "Might I speak with you briefly? About a delicate matter." His expression shifted to professional concern. They retired to the morning room, and she forced herself to voice what she had never spoken aloud. "I wonder if there might be something wrong with me that prevents—" She could not finish. Dr. Harwick's confusion was immediate and genuine. "Wrong with you, my lady? I assure you, there is nothing wrong with you. Your constitution is perfectly sound." But the Earl said. She stopped, uncertain how to continue. "Ah!" Understanding dawned on the physician's weathered face, followed quickly by discomfort. "My lady, forgive me, but I believe there may be some misunderstanding. His lordship's situation is not a matter of capability. It is a matter of choice." The words took several seconds to arrange themselves into meaning. When they did, the morning room seemed to shift around her, familiar objects becoming suddenly strange. "Choice," she repeated, her voice remarkably steady. Dr. Harwick looked as though he desperately wished to be elsewhere. "After Miss Catherine's death, his lordship made his feelings quite clear to me. He blamed himself for her condition, you see. Believed he had no right to risk another woman's life in such a manner. I tried to explain that childbirth, while dangerous, is not inevitably fatal, but grief does not respond well to logic." He paused. "I assumed he had discussed this with you." She thanked him mechanically and waited until his footsteps faded before allowing herself to move. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her skirts and tried to breathe past the pressure building in her chest. Not incapable. Not afflicted by some physical impediment that made heirs impossible. He had chosen this. Chosen to marry her under false pretenses. Chosen to let her believe herself inadequate while he orchestrated their barrenness with deliberate intent. The locked door near his chambers suddenly made new sense. The separate routines, the careful distance, the way he never allowed warmth to deepen into anything that might become permanent. All of it designed, controlled. An architecture of protection built on deception. She thought of the society matrons with their remedies and prayers. The aunt's pointed remarks about duty and lineage. Her own midnight inventories of failure, cataloguing every perceived inadequacy in her body, her manner, her worthiness. He had watched her shoulder that blame. Had defended her from direct inquiry while allowing her to suffer privately under the weight of an inadequacy that did not exist. The cruelty was not in his distance. It was in his silence. In letting her believe the lie when he knew the truth would have freed her from months of self-condemnation. She stood in the morning room as afternoon light slanted through windows, and understood with sudden, terrible clarity that her husband had not protected her at all. He had protected himself. Protected his vow to a dead woman. Protected his guilt and his grief and his conviction that safety required the sacrifice of her future along with his own. And he had never asked her permission. It was not fate that stood between them. It was not her body or the will of God or any force beyond human control. It was simply his resolve. His decision. His choice to bind them both to a promise she had never been permitted to accept or refuse with full understanding. The hurt that flooded through her was so profound it felt almost like drowning. She did not confront him. The words existed, accusations and questions and demands for explanation, but they remained locked behind her careful composure. Instead, she watched him with new understanding, and the watching was its own particular agony. He continued as he always had. Kind, distant, unfailingly courteous. At breakfast, he inquired whether she had slept well. In the library, he ensured the fire was built up before she arrived. When they walked the gardens, he pointed out the first winter buds with the gentle enthusiasm he reserved for living things that required tending. Nothing in his manner suggested he carried any burden heavier than the usual concerns of estate management. But now she saw the architecture beneath his composure. Every maintained boundary was a brick in the wall he had built between himself and the possibility of loss. Every retreat was not rejection but protection, though whether he was protecting her or himself, she could no longer tell. She found herself replaying moments with this new knowledge coloring everything. The way his hand had hovered near her waist at a ball before falling away. How his eyes sometimes held something warm before he blinked it into absence. The morning she had been ill and he had sat beside her bed for hours, reading aloud, his voice carrying a tenderness his touch never permitted. All of it had been restrained desire, love deliberately strangled before it could take root and bloom into something that might be lost. He was protecting her, she realized. In his own terrible way, he believed he was sparing her the fate that had claimed Catherine. He had decided, without consultation, without her consent, that denying her children was preferable to risking her life. That emotional distance was safer than intimacy. That a marriage of careful friendship was sufficient when the alternative was grief. The realization brought no comfort. Because his protection had cost her everything he claimed to be preserving. He had taken her choice, her agency, her right to decide what risks she was willing to bear. He had looked at her and seen only Catherine's ghost, only death waiting in the wings, only another loss he could prevent through sufficient control. One evening in the library, she looked up from her correspondence to find him watching her with unguarded longing. For a breath, she saw everything he worked so hard to hide, wanton grief and something that looked remarkably like love, all of it bound so tightly he could barely breathe around it. Then he caught himself, looked away, and asked if she needed better light for her writing. "No," she said quietly. "I have everything I need." The lie tasted like ashes. She began to understand the full dimensions of her heartbreak. She loved him, had perhaps loved him for months without recognizing it, but the man she loved did not truly exist. He was a performance, a careful construction designed to keep everyone, including himself, at a safe distance. The real James Colborne was buried under layers of guilt and grief and iron control, and he had no intention of ever letting anyone excavate him. Some nights she stood at the connecting door between their chambers and pressed her palm against the wood. She could hear him beyond it, awake as she was awake, both of them lying alone in the darkness, separated by inches and miles simultaneously. Once, she thought she heard him approach the door from his side, sensed his presence mirroring hers. But neither of them turned the handle. The cruelty was this: she could not hate him. Because beneath the betrayal, beneath the hurt of his deception, she understood. He had lost everything once. He had watched the woman he loved die carrying his child, and grief had convinced him that love itself was the danger. So he had chosen safety, control. A marriage that could never cut deep enough to leave scars because it would never be permitted to touch anything vital. He had denied her a future because he believed futures were promises that could not be kept. He had withheld honesty because honesty would have required vulnerability, and vulnerability was the door through which loss entered. She understood. And understanding made it worse. Because it meant there was no villain to hate, no clear wrong to fight against. There was only a man so wounded by the past that he had built his entire life around preventing its repetition, even if prevention required sacrificing the present. Even if it required sacrificing her. The invitation arrived in spring, cream paper embossed with the Pemberton crest. Lady Pemberton was hosting a christening for her newest grandchild, and the Ashfords were cordially invited to attend the celebration and luncheon following the service. Evelyn held the invitation and felt something shift in her chest, a small crack in the careful restraint she had maintained for months. Lord Ashford read his copy over breakfast without visible reaction. We should send our regrets, he said. The journey to London would be tiring this time of year. I would like to attend. He looked up, surprise flickering across his features before discipline reasserted itself. If you wish it, of course. I merely thought that I would prefer to avoid watching another woman celebrate what I cannot have. The words emerged sharper than intended. She set down her teacup with deliberate care. I am not so fragile as you believe, my lord. They made the journey in near silence, the carriage carrying them toward a celebration of new life while the space between them filled with everything unspoken. Evelyn watched the countryside pass and wondered when exactly she had become complicit in her own erasure, accepting his protection as though it were kindness rather than control. The christening was brief, the ceremony tender. Evelyn stood in the pew and watched Lady Pemberton cradle her grandchild with the fierce joy of someone who had been granted precisely what she hoped for. Around them, women whispered and smiled and made plans to call upon the new mother. The air felt thick with fertility, with futures unfolding exactly as society expected them to. At the luncheon, Lady Pemberton approached with sympathy radiating from every line of her face. My dear Lady Ashford, how brave of you to come. I know this must be difficult. It is a celebration, Evelyn replied with practiced composure. There is nothing difficult about joy. Still. Lady Pemberton lowered her voice to a whisper meant to convey discretion. One cannot help but feel for you. Such a disappointment, and through no fault of your own. The Earl is fortunate you bear it with such grace. Something in Evelyn's chest tightened. No fault of my own. Well, naturally. When a marriage fails to produce heirs, the fault lies with nature, not intent. You must not blame yourself, dear. She patted Evelyn's hand with the confidence of someone dispensing wisdom. Some women simply are not made for childbearing. It is God's will, however mysterious. The words landed like stones. Evelyn stood surrounded by christening guests, by women who had fulfilled their purpose, by the soft sounds of an infant being passed between adoring relatives, and felt the full weight of her husband's deception crash over her anew. These people pitied her. They had constructed an entire narrative around her inadequacy, one her husband had permitted them to believe. He had stood silent while society decided she was barren, broken, a wife who had failed at her singular essential duty. He had let her absorb that shame, had watched her carry it alone, had never once corrected the assumption because correction would have required explaining the truth. And the truth was this: she had been given no choice. Not in the marriage itself, that had been necessity, survival, the best option among limited alternatives. But in everything after. In whether to risk motherhood. In whether his past losses should dictate her future. In whether love should be permitted to grow or strangled in its infancy. Every decision had been his, made in silence, presented as inevitable when it was simply chosen. She excused herself and found refuge in Lady Pemberton's garden, where spring bloomed with oblivious abundance. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them together and tried to breathe past the pressure building behind her ribs. Lord Ashford found her there 20 minutes later. He approached carefully, as though she were something wild that might startle. Are you unwell? Should I call for the carriage? No. She kept her gaze on the garden, on roses that grew without restraint. I am perfectly well, my lord. As everyone has reminded me, some women are simply not made for childbearing. God's will, apparently. He went very still. Evelyn. How long did you intend to let them believe it? She turned to face him, and something in her expression made him take a step back. How long were you content to watch me be pitted for a failure that does not exist? To let society construct its comfortable narrative about my inadequacy while you remained silent? I never wanted you to bear that burden. Then you should have told the truth. Her voice remained quiet, but it carried weight now, months of accumulated hurt given shape. You should have said, my wife is perfectly capable. It is I who have decided to deny her children. I who have made a vow that binds us both. I who have chosen safety over possibility. But you did not. You let them blame me because it was easier than explaining yourself. I thought I was protecting you. From what? Truth? Choice? The right to decide my own future. She felt tears building but refused to let them fall. Your silence was not protection, James. It was cruelty, and I can no longer pretend otherwise. The carriage ride back to Ashford Manor stretched across hours of silence so complete it felt like a physical presence between them. He sat across from her, his face turned toward the window, his hands resting on his knees with that familiar controlled stillness. She watched the countryside darken and wondered if this was how marriages ended, not with grand confrontations, but with the slow accumulation of truths left unspoken until speech itself became impossible. They arrived after nightfall. He handed her down from the carriage with the same courteous distance he had maintained for a year, and she thought perhaps nothing would change after all. Perhaps they would simply continue this careful dance until one or both of them died of loneliness disguised as civility. But as she moved toward the staircase, his voice stopped her. Would you join me in the library, please? It was the please that made her turn. She had never heard him ask for anything with quite that note of desperation barely restrained. The library fire had been lit against the evening chill. He stood before it, his back to her, and for a long moment said nothing. She waited, her heart beating too quickly, wondering if he would speak or if this too would dissolve into the silence that had defined them. I was 22 when Catherine died. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, as though he were remarking on the weather. She was 20. We had known each other since childhood, and I had loved her for nearly as long. When she agreed to marry me, I thought I understood what happiness meant. Evelyn remained by the door, afraid that any movement might shatter whatever fragile honesty was building in the room. She came to visit the estate that summer. The fever started as something minor, a headache, slight chills. By the time we realized it was serious, it was too late. He turned then, and the look on his face was so raw she almost looked away. She was 3 months gone with child. The physicians said the fever might not have killed her if not for her condition. That pregnancy weakens the body, makes women more susceptible. They said it so matter-of-factly, as though they were discussing the weather rather than explaining why the woman I loved was dying. James. I held her hand while she died. It took 3 days. She was delirious most of that time, but in the moments when she recognized me, she would apologize. For failing me. For failing the child. For not being strong enough. His voice cracked slightly. She died apologizing, and I stood there knowing it was my fault. I had done this to her. My desire for a family, my need for heirs, my inability to simply leave well enough alone, all of it had killed her as surely as the fever. Evelyn's throat ached with tears she could not release. She understood now, with terrible clarity, the shape of his guilt. I made a vow at her grave. That I would never put another woman at risk. That whatever future I had would not be built on the possibility of death in childbed. I thought I meant it as protection, for others, for myself, for the memory of what I had lost. He looked at her directly now. And then my aunt arranged our marriage, and I thought it would be acceptable. A marriage of convenience. Protection for you, companionship for me, and no risk to anyone because I would ensure the question never arose. You never asked me, she said softly. You decided for both of us. I know. The admission seemed to cost him something. I told myself I was being noble, sparing you the choice because the choice itself was cruel. But what I was really doing was controlling everything so I would never have to risk grief again. I built walls around myself and called them protection when they were really just cowardice. She moved closer, drawn by the raw honesty in his voice. When did you realize that I loved you? He laughed, bitter and brief. Months ago. Perhaps from the beginning. I watched you reading in the library and thought about how peaceful you looked. I walked with you in the garden and found myself wanting to tell you things I had told no one. I saw you accept society's pity with such grace and felt myself a coward for allowing it. He met her eyes. I loved you, and I resented you for it. Because loving you meant I had failed at the one thing I swore to do, stay distant enough that loss could never destroy me again. The tears came now, silent and unstoppable. If you had told me the truth, if you had given me the choice, I would have chosen you anyway. He went very still. Evelyn. Do you think I am so fragile? So foolish? She closed the remaining distance between them, stopping just short of touching. I know childbirth is dangerous. I watched my mother die of it. But I also know that danger is not certainty, and protection is not the same as prison. If you had asked me, if you had trusted me with the truth, I would have said yes. To you. To the risk. To the possibility of a future built on something other than fear. I cannot ask that of you. You already have. Her voice was steady now, clear. By marrying me, by letting me fall in love with you, by building this careful friendship that feels like intimacy without ever permitting it to become real. You have asked everything of me except the one thing that matters, my consent to the life we live. He reached for her then, his hand trembling slightly as it cupped her face. The touch was gentle, reverent, and so full of longing it made her chest ache. I am terrified, he whispered. Of losing you. Of failing you. Of discovering that love is always temporary and loss is always inevitable. Then be terrified with me, she said. But stop deciding alone what risks we take. Stop protecting me from choices I have the right to make. Stop loving me so carefully that it feels like nothing at all. His forehead lowered to rest against hers, and she felt him shake with something between laughter and grief. I have been so careful for so long. I do not know how to be any other way. Then learn. She brought her hands up to rest against his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath her palms. We will both learn. Together. With honesty instead of silence. With trust instead of control. I do not deserve you. Perhaps not. She smiled despite the tears. But I am choosing you anyway. That is what love means, James. Not protecting each other from pain, but standing together when it comes. He kissed her then, finally, a kiss that held years of restrained longing and months of accumulated grief and the tentative, terrifying hope of two people who had both been alone too long. It was not gentle or careful or controlled. It was honest. And that honesty was worth more than all his careful protection had ever been. When they broke apart, she said quietly, no promises about the future. No guarantees. Just the truth, from now on. Can you give me that? He nodded, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Yes. The truth. Even when it frightens me. Especially then, she corrected. Especially then, he agreed. Spring arrived late that year, as though even the seasons had been waiting for permission to begin. The gardens at Ashford Manor woke slowly, carefully, each bud unfurling only when it was certain winter had truly passed. Evelyn walked among them in the early mornings, watching this gradual resurrection with something that felt remarkably like hope. Things changed, though not in the dramatic fashion of novels or the sudden transformation society expected. The door between their chambers remained, she had no desire to erase it, but it stood open now more often than closed. Some nights he read aloud to her until she fell asleep. Other nights they simply talked, the conversations meandering through subjects they had avoided for a year, his childhood, her mother's death, fears that lost their power when spoken into lamplight rather than held in silence. They began taking breakfast together, a small shift that the servants noticed but did not comment upon. Mrs. Daintree's eyes held something softer now when she looked at them, as though she recognized that whatever unusual arrangement had defined the marriage was evolving into something more familiar, more whole. He still tended his roses with devoted attention, but he invited her to join him now. She learned the names of varieties she had only admired from a distance, Maiden's Blush, Empress Josephine, the Alba Maxima that bloomed white as snow. He showed her how to prune without causing harm, how to recognize disease before it spread, how to nurture growth while respecting the plant's own resilience. They are stronger than they appear, he said one morning, his hands gentle on a stem that had survived an unexpected frost. We think we must protect them from everything, but often they simply need space to grow and the trust that they will survive what comes. She looked at him, at the man who was learning, slowly, imperfectly, to offer trust instead of control. Yes, she said. Often that is exactly what they need. They spoke about the future in pieces, never forcing conclusions but allowing possibilities to exist without immediate resolution. He told her his fears about childbirth with an honesty that sometimes made his voice shake. She told him hers, not just about dying, but about never being permitted to try, about a life lived so carefully that nothing meaningful ever happened within it. "I cannot promise I will not be afraid," he admitted one evening as they sat in the library, the space between them on the sofa smaller than it had been weeks before. "I am not asking you to stop being afraid," she replied. "Only to stop deciding alone what to do with that fear." He reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together with a care that no longer felt like restraint but like reverence. "Then we decide together. All of it. No more silence." "No more silence," she agreed. A letter arrived from his aunt in June, delicately inquiring about heirs with the persistence of someone who believed duty superseded personal feeling. They read it together over breakfast, and when he began to compose his usual evasive response, Evelyn touched his wrist. "Tell her the truth," she said quietly. He looked at her, uncertain. "That we have not yet decided. That the future is ours to determine, not society's to demand." "Yes. Exactly that." The letter he wrote was brief, honest, and notably lacking in apology. When he sealed it, his hands were steadier than she had seen them in months. Rain came in the afternoons that summer, gentle and persistent, soaking the gardens until everything gleamed. Evelyn stood at the window one day and watched water run down the glass, pooling in places before finding paths to follow downward. Behind her, she heard James enter the room, felt him pause as he always did when he found her lost in thought. "What are you thinking?" he asked, and the question carried none of the careful neutrality it once would have. He genuinely wanted to know. "That nothing is certain," she said. "That we cannot predict what will happen, or control all the outcomes, or protect each other from every possible pain." She felt him tense slightly, heard the old fear in his silence. "But also," she continued, turning to face him, "that uncertainty is not the same as hopelessness. That the future can be built on trust rather than fear. That sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply choose each other, every day, without guarantees." He crossed the room and pulled her close, his embrace no longer tentative but sure. They stood together watching the rain, two people who had learned, were still learning, that love did not require the elimination of risk. Only the willingness to face it together. In the garden, roses bloomed despite the weather. Spring had given way to summer, and summer would yield to autumn, and the seasons would continue their inevitable progression regardless of human fear or hope. But in this moment, in this room, two people had chosen to stop deciding their future in silence. The choice itself was the beginning. Not of certainty, but of possibility. Not of guaranteed happiness, but of honest partnership. Not of safety, but of trust. And that, they discovered, was enough. The Ton eventually stopped speculating about the Ashford marriage. Some said it remained childless, others whispered of a quiet happiness that needed no heirs to justify its existence. The truth, as is often the case, was more complicated than gossip allowed. But this observer knows what the others missed, that the Real story was never about children or duty or what society expected. It was about two people learning to choose each other with full knowledge, full consent, and the terrifying courage that honest love requires. For the first time, their future was not decided in silence. And in that choice, that simple, profound choice, they found something worth more than all the careful protection in the world. They found each other. Some loves are never spoken of. Others are remembered. If you wish to hear more tales of love restrained by duty and desire, you may subscribe discreetly.